I never imagined that a simple greeting in sign language would change everything. But looking back now, I can see that the moment I approached that visitor in our lobby, the careful structure of my invisible existence began to crack. My name is Maya Rodriguez, and for 2 years I'd been a junior customer service representative at Horizon Solutions, one of those gleaming tech companies in downtown Seattle where the office furniture costs more than my annual salary and everyone speaks in buzzwords about disruption and synergy. I occupied a small desk tucked near the reception area, close enough to the main flow of the office to see everything, far enough from the executive floor to be functionally invisible to anyone who mattered. My supervisor, Karen, made sure of that invisibility, even as she built her own reputation on the foundation of my work, my ideas, my late nights refining strategies she'd present as her own the next morning. I'd learned sign language growing up with my younger brother Daniel, who was born deaf, and it had become as natural to me as breathing, just another part of who I was, something I never thought about until I needed it. That particular Tuesday afternoon, I'd been answering phones and directing visitors with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd perfected the art of being helpful while remaining unseen, when three people walked through the glass doors and everything shifted. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to what my days were actually like, to the particular texture of being overlooked in a place where I spent more waking hours than anywhere else. Every morning, I arrived at 7:45, 15 minutes before my shift officially started, because I'd learned that Karen noticed when I was merely on time and somehow never noticed when I was early. I'd make coffee, review the day's schedule, prepare materials for client calls, and settle into my desk just as my colleagues began trickling in around 8:15, most of them barely acknowledging my existence with a nod or distracted half-smile. Karen would arrive at 8:30, carrying her expensive leather bag and her air of harried importance, sweep past my desk without greeting, and disappear into her office, where she'd spend the first hour scrolling through the work I'd completed the night before. By 9, she'd emerge with assignments that were somehow always urgent, always necessary, always positioned as though she'd conceived them herself rather than simply repackaging my suggestions from our team meetings. The meetings where she had a remarkable talent for interrupting me mid-sentence or dismissing my contributions with a tight smile before presenting the exact same idea 15 minutes later as though it had just occurred to her. I told myself this was normal, that this was paying dues, that if I just kept my head down and did excellent work, someone would eventually notice. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click. But for me, it means a lot. The most specific example of Karen's theft happened 6 months before that Tuesday in the lobby. Back in March, when I'd spent 3 weeks developing a comprehensive client retention strategy that analyzed communication gaps in our customer service protocols and proposed a tiered response system based on client value and complaint complexity. I'd researched competitor approaches, interviewed frontline service representatives, including myself, examined 2 years of client feedback data, and created a presentation that outlined not just the problems, but actionable solutions with projected cost savings of approximately $340,000 annually for our region alone. I'd sent it to Karen on a Thursday evening with a note explaining that I thought it might be worth discussing with the regional management team, and she'd responded with a brief, "Thanks, I'll review," that I'd taken as encouragement. The following Tuesday, there was a management meeting I wasn't invited to, which wasn't unusual since junior representatives rarely attended those sessions. But when Karen returned to our floor that afternoon, she was practically glowing with satisfaction. And I learned from Sophie later that week that Karen had presented her innovative retention strategy to enthusiastic reception from Mark Thompson and the other regional directors. Karen never mentioned my work, never asked if she could present it, never suggested I might want to be in that meeting or at minimum receive credit for the research and analysis I'd poured myself into during late nights at my apartment when I should have been sleeping. When I carefully asked her about it the next day, trying to keep my voice neutral and professional, She'd looked at me with this practiced expression of patient condescension and said, Maya, when you work on a team, the team gets credit. And as your supervisor, I represent our team to leadership. That's how organizations function. And the sooner you understand that, the better your career will progress. I'd nodded and returned to my desk with that particular hollow feeling in my chest that I was learning to recognize as my daily companion. The sense that I was somehow failing to understand basic professional rules that everyone else had mastered. Sophie found me in the break room that afternoon and asked if I was okay, and I tried to explain without sounding bitter or ungrateful. But Sophie had immediately understood what happened. She stole your work, Sophie said flatly, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced with anger on my behalf. And you should report it to HR or Mark Thompson directly. But I couldn't afford to make waves, couldn't risk being labeled as difficult or ungrateful or a troublemaker, because I was sending $800 every month to help my mother with rent and Daniel's expenses, still paying $430 monthly on my student loans from Washington State, and living in a studio apartment in Northgate that cost $1,450 because anything cheaper meant an hour commute each way. I told Sophie I appreciated her support, but I needed this job, needed the stability, and that maybe Karen was right about how teams worked. Sophie had looked at me with frustration and sadness and said, Maya, that's not how good teams work, and you deserve better than this. But I just shrugged and changed the subject because believing I deserved better while doing nothing about it hurt worse than accepting this was just how things were. The pattern continued through spring and into summer, Karen assigning me tasks that were somehow always both urgent and beneath my qualifications, asking me to compile reports she'd then present without attribution, interrupting me in our weekly team meetings whenever I tried to contribute ideas, and maintaining this careful system where my work built her reputation while I remained precisely where I'd started. Then, last week, Karen had swept into the office with unusual excitement and announced that we'd be having very important visitors the following Tuesday, that everyone needed to be on their absolute best behavior, and that she'd be presenting our department's client retention success story to corporate leadership. And I'd felt that familiar sting of watching my strategy become her achievement once again. The week leading up to that Tuesday visitor was a perfect distillation of everything my professional life had become, a concentrated dose of dismissal and extra work that left me exhausted in ways that went beyond simple physical tiredness. Karen had decided that the presentation needed to be absolutely perfect, which apparently meant that I would spend every evening that week staying late to refine slides, compile additional data, format charts, and proofread documents that she would present without ever mentioning my name or contributions, and each night I'd leave the office around 9 or 10, ride the bus back to Northgate in the dark, and fall into bed knowing I'd be back in 7 hours to do it all again. On Wednesday afternoon during our team meeting, I'd suggested that we might want to include some client testimonials in the presentation to give it more personal impact, and Karen had interrupted me before I'd finished my sentence to say, Maya, let's stay focused on data rather than anecdotes, only to watch her present that exact idea as her own insight 10 minutes later, framed as, what we really need here is the human element, some client testimonials to make this resonate emotionally. I'd caught Sophie's eye across the table and seen her barely suppressed anger on my behalf. But I'd just looked down at my notes and reminded myself that this was temporary, that I was building experience, that eventually someone would see past Karen's performance to the actual substance beneath. That evening, Sophie found me in the break room where I was microwaving leftover pasta at 7:30, everyone else long gone, and she'd said, Maya, come get coffee with me, please. You need a break from this place. And even though I had 3 more hours of work ahead of me, I'd agreed, because Sophie's friendship was one of the few things that made the office bearable. We'd gone to the Starbucks 2 blocks away, and Sophie had looked at me with this combination of concern and frustration and asked how long I was going to let Karen treat me like this, and I'd admitted something I hadn't told anyone else. I'd been applying to other companies for 3 months, had sent out 27 applications to various tech firms and marketing companies around Seattle, and had received exactly 2 responses, both rejections. I felt trapped, I told Sophie, trapped by my student loans and my family's financial needs, and the reality that jobs weren't easy to find, and I couldn't afford to be unemployed, couldn't afford to make waves or push back or do anything that might risk the steady paycheck that kept my mother housed and helped Daniel with his expenses, and slowly, painfully chipped away at my debt. Sophie had reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said, "Your worth isn't determined by Karen's inability to see it," which had made me cry right there in the Starbucks, embarrassing tears I'd wiped away quickly while she pretended not to notice. The night before the big visit, Monday evening, Karen had appeared at my desk at 6:45 with a stack of last-minute changes, saying she'd been thinking about the presentation flow and needed me to reorganize the entire middle section and create 4 new charts, comparing our retention rates to industry averages. And could I have it done tonight, because we needed to do a final review first thing in the morning. I'd stayed until 11, alone in the empty office with its motion sensor lights clicking off around me every 20 minutes until I moved enough to trigger them again, perfecting charts that visualized data I'd compiled, arguments I'd developed, strategies I'd created, all of it packaged for Karen's delivery to people who would never know I existed. Riding the bus home that night, I'd had this moment of clarity where I asked myself why I accepted this, why I tolerated being treated as though my work and my ideas and my time were simply resources for Karen to exploit. And I'd told myself the same thing I always did. It was temporary, hard work would eventually be noticed. I just needed to be patient and keep proving myself, and eventually the right person would see what I was capable of, and then everything would change. I had no idea that the next afternoon would prove that last thought correct in ways I couldn't have possibly imagined, that the right person would indeed notice, and that my careful, invisible existence was about to be shattered completely. Tuesday morning, I arrived at the office at 7:15, a full hour and 45 minutes before my usual start time, because I wanted to make absolutely certain that everything was perfect for Karen's presentation, even though she would never acknowledge the effort, and I would spend the entire day watching from the margins while she performed with materials I'd created. The office had been transformed overnight by the facilities team, the normally utilitarian reception area now featuring fresh flower arrangements on the desk where I'd been stationed, the conference room visible through its glass walls, polished and prepared with bottled water at each seat, and the large screen tested and ready, everything designed to impress whoever these important visitors were that had Karen so energized and the entire management team so carefully orchestrated. Karen arrived at 8:30, looking particularly polished in a navy suit I'd never seen before, swept past my temporary post at the reception desk without greeting me, and went directly to her office, where she spent the next 30 minutes reviewing the presentation materials I'd left perfectly organized on her desk the night before, materials she collected at 9 o'clock with a brief, "Make sure you're presentable, you're covering reception today." That confirmed what I'd already suspected about my role in this important day. My regular responsibilities for the day had been distributed to other team members. I discovered when I checked my email, because Mark Thompson wanted our best face forward for greeting, which was apparently corporate speak for putting me at a desk in the lobby where I could answer phones and direct visitors while the actual important work happened elsewhere. And the assignment stung in a way that was familiar, but somehow sharper today. Maybe because I'd worked until 11 the night before perfecting materials for a meeting I wouldn't attend. Sophie came through the lobby around 10:30 on her way to a meeting and paused at my desk with this look of frustrated sympathy, leaned close and whispered, "This is wrong, Maya. You should be in that presentation, not stuck out here like you're not part of the team." And I just shrugged because what could I say that wouldn't sound like complaining or bitterness? And besides, I'd made my peace with being invisible, or at least I'd convinced myself I had. The office energy built steadily through the morning. people moving with unusual purpose and careful attention to appearance. Conversations happening in lowered voices about whoever was coming this afternoon. Speculation that this wasn't just a routine client visit, but something more significant. Maybe someone from corporate headquarters, or a major investor, or some executive whose opinion could reshape careers and futures. I didn't pay much attention to the rumors, because I'd learned that important visitors and significant meetings rarely changed anything for me. My career seemingly fixed at this entry level, regardless of my contributions or the hours I worked, or the strategies I developed that Karen presented as her own. Around noon, I ate the sandwich I'd brought at my desk while covering phones, and I let myself think about Daniel for a few minutes. Let myself feel the small, warm pride that came from knowing he'd been accepted to Gallaudet University starting next fall, that my $800 monthly contributions to help my mother were indirectly helping him pursue this dream, and that even if my professional life felt stagnant and diminishing, at least my sacrifices were making possible something meaningful and beautiful in my brother's life. The afternoon stretched ahead with anticipation I didn't share, everyone waiting for 2 o'clock, and the arrival of whoever these mysterious, important visitors were, and I occupied myself with routine tasks, while trying not to think about how even on days that mattered to everyone else, I remained exactly where I'd always been, present but unseen, contributing but uncredited, working but invisible. At exactly 2 o'clock, I looked up from the visitor log I'd been pretending to organize and saw 3 people entering through the building's main glass doors, their silhouettes backlit by the bright September afternoon before they stepped fully into the lobby's fluorescent lighting, where I could see them clearly. 2 men in business suits who moved with the confident efficiency of executives accustomed to being the most important people in any room. And between them, an older gentleman, perhaps in his early 60s, with silver hair and an elegant charcoal suit, who was signing to the younger man on his left, his hands moving in the fluid, graceful patterns I'd known since childhood. I didn't think about it, didn't pause to consider protocol or propriety, or whether this was appropriate for someone at my level. I simply stood up from behind the reception desk and moved toward them, because when you grow up with ASL as your second language, you develop an instinct for moments when you can make someone's experience easier, when you can offer the gift of direct communication instead of forcing someone to work through an interpreter, or write notes or navigate the awkward accommodations that hearing people often provide with good intentions but limited understanding. I approached the group and signed, "Good afternoon, welcome to Horizon Solutions, my name is Maya, how may I help you?" And watched the older man's entire face transform with surprised delight, his eyes widening and then crinkling with genuine pleasure as he responded in ASL, "What a wonderful surprise, thank you. It's so rare to be greeted in my own language." And just like that, we were having a real direct conversation without barriers or intermediaries. I asked if he needed anything, offered to get water or coffee, asked about his journey to our building, and he responded with warmth and engagement, telling me he'd flown in from San Francisco that morning and asking how long I'd been signing. And I explained about Daniel, about growing up with a deaf brother, and how ASL had become as natural to me as English, maybe more natural in some ways because it was the language of my home and my heart. The 2 hearing executives watched our exchange with interest, seeming pleased by the interaction, and I noticed the younger one smile slightly as the older gentleman asked me how long I'd worked at Horizon Solutions and what my role was here, questions I answered honestly, explaining that I'd been with the company for 3 years in client services, supporting our customer retention initiatives, and mentioning that my brother had just been accepted to Gallaudet University, which made the older man's face light up even more as he congratulated me and said that Gallaudet was an exceptional institution. The conversation lasted perhaps 2 minutes, maybe 3, just a natural, friendly exchange that felt effortless and right. And then Karen appeared from the elevator bank, moving toward us with quick, purposeful steps and an expression that managed to combine professional enthusiasm with barely concealed alarm that I was bothering these important visitors. She swooped in with exaggerated cheerfulness, speaking directly to the deaf gentleman in that overly loud, overly enunciated way that hearing people sometimes use when they don't understand that volume doesn't help, saying, "Welcome, welcome, we're so honored to have you here. I'm Karen Morrison. I'll be presenting today." And I smoothly signed her words for him while maintaining my professional composure, facilitating rather than inserting myself. The older gentleman asked me in ASL what my position was and whether I'd be joining the meeting, and I explained that I worked in a support role and wouldn't be attending, and something flickered across his face, some brief expression I couldn't quite read before he thanked me warmly for my kindness and told me it had been genuinely lovely to meet me. Karen ushered the group toward the elevators. The older gentleman glanced back at me once with a thoughtful expression I didn't understand. And then they disappeared into the elevator, and I returned to my desk thinking nothing more of it, except that I was glad I'd been able to help, glad I'd made someone's day a little easier, and completely unaware that those 2 minutes of natural, authentic connection had set in motion something that would change everything. I returned to my reception desk after the elevator doors closed on Karen and her important guests, settled back into the routine tasks of answering phones and routing calls, and trying not to think too much about the fact that upstairs in the glass-walled conference room, my work was being presented as someone else's achievement, and for the next 2 hours, the office hummed with an energy I could feel even from my isolated position in the lobby, people moving with purpose between floors, the coffee station on the second floor getting unusually heavy traffic as employees found excuses to walk past the conference room and catch glimpses of whatever was happening inside. Around 3:30, Sophie appeared at my desk, moving quickly down from the third floor, her eyes wide with this expression that was half excitement and half disbelief, and she leaned close over the reception counter and whispered, "Maya, do you have any idea who that was?" And I shook my head, because I'd been wondering but hadn't really cared enough to pursue the question. Figured it was some regional VP or important client whose name I'd never heard, and whose opinion of our office would be shaped entirely by Karen's presentation. Sophie glanced around to make sure no one was in earshot and said, "That was Richard Chen, the CEO of the entire company, like the founder, the actual top person." And I felt something cold and startling drop through my stomach, because I'd greeted the CEO of Horizon Solutions in the lobby like he was just anyone, had chatted with him casually about my brother and Gallaudet, had been friendly and informal in a way that now seemed potentially inappropriate or presumptuous. I must have looked panicked, because Sophie immediately said, "No, no, it's good, Maya. He almost never visits regional offices. He's famously private. There aren't even photos of him in our building, and he's known for caring about how employees treat people, like he pays attention to whether people are authentic or just performing." And I processed this information while my mind raced back through our interaction, trying to remember if I'd said anything wrong, or been too casual, or crossed some professional boundary I didn't know existed. Sophie explained that Richard Chen had built Horizon Solutions from nothing 20 years ago, that he was deaf and had faced constant dismissal and underestimation in the tech industry before proving everyone wrong, that he was worth somewhere in the range of $800 million, but still visited offices unannounced to see how they really functioned, and that he had very particular values about authenticity and recognizing talent and creating environments where capability mattered more than politics or performance. I asked if I'd done something wrong by approaching him, and Sophie looked at me like I was missing something obvious and said, "Maya, you were kind and natural and treated him like a person. That's exactly right. That's literally the opposite of wrong." But I still felt anxious and uncertain, worried that I'd somehow inserted myself inappropriately into something that wasn't my business. The meeting continued upstairs, and I could see through the glass walls when I glanced up from my desk, could see Karen animated and confident, gesturing to slides I'd created, presenting the retention strategy I'd developed over 6 months of careful analysis and testing, and the familiar sting of watching someone else receive credit for my ideas settled over me like a weight I'd grown accustomed to carrying. I tried to focus on my work, on the phones and the visitor log, and the mundane tasks that filled my days, telling myself it didn't matter, that this was just how things worked, that my time would come eventually if I just kept my head down and continued producing good work. But something felt different today. There was an electricity in the building that I couldn't quite name, a sense that something significant was shifting, even though I couldn't identify what or how. The afternoon wore on with excruciating slowness, the meeting stretching past 4 o'clock and then 4:30, and finally around 5 the conference room doors opened and people began emerging. Karen looking absolutely triumphant, with this glow of satisfaction that suggested the presentation had gone even better than she'd hoped. Mark Thompson and the other executives looking pleased and energized, and Richard Chen and his two colleagues gathering their materials and preparing to leave. I watched them move toward the elevators and assumed that was the end of it, that these important visitors would disappear back to wherever they'd come from, and life would return to its normal patterns of invisibility and overlooked contributions. And I began my usual end-of-day routine of organizing the reception desk and preparing the lobby for the next morning, completely unaware that something had been set in motion that would change absolutely everything. I assumed the visit was over when the elevator doors closed behind Richard Chen and his colleagues. Assumed that whatever significance the day had held was now finished, and I could return to the comfortable invisibility of my regular routine. So I began straightening the visitor logs and organizing the reception desk brochures and preparing to shut down my computer for the evening. The office around me gradually emptying as people filtered toward the exits carrying briefcases and shoulder bags and talking about dinner plans or traffic routes home. I was just reaching for my jacket when I saw movement near the elevator bank and looked up to see Richard Chen stepping back into the lobby alone, without his assistants or the executives who'd accompanied him upstairs, and he was walking directly toward my desk with clear purpose. His expression thoughtful and focused in a way that made my heart rate accelerate with sudden nervousness. He approached and signed, "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" And I nodded quickly, signed back, "Of course," trying to keep my hands steady and my expression professionally calm, even though my mind was racing with questions about what the CEO of the entire company could possibly want to discuss with someone at my level. He gestured to the small seating area near the windows where visitors sometimes waited, a cluster of modern chairs around a low table, and we sat down facing each other while the last few employees trickled past us toward the exits, some glancing curiously at this unusual scene, but no one interrupting. Richard asked me questions about my work, how long I'd been at Horizon Solutions, what my daily responsibilities included, what aspects of my job I found most engaging, and I answered honestly but carefully, not wanting to overstep or say anything that might sound like complaining or seem unprofessional, explaining that I'd been here 3 years and that I enjoyed working with clients and developing strategies to improve their experience and retention. He asked about Daniel, about how I'd learned ASL and how fluent I was, and I told him about growing up with a deaf brother and how signing had become second nature, how it was just part of how our family communicated, and his expression softened with recognition and understanding as he shared that he'd grown up in a hearing family that never learned to sign fluently, that he'd found his community and his language later, and it had changed everything about how he moved through the world. Our conversation felt warm and natural, despite the surreal fact that I was sitting with the founder and CEO of a major tech company, and gradually I forgot to be quite so nervous, fell into the comfortable rhythm of ASL conversation that had always felt more natural to me than formal business English. Then he asked a question that made me pause. "Do you feel your contributions are recognized here?" And I hesitated because I didn't want to speak badly of Karen or seem ungrateful for the opportunity I had, but I also couldn't bring myself to lie directly to someone who was asking with such genuine interest and attention. So my hands stayed still for several seconds while I tried to formulate a response that was honest without being inappropriate. And finally I signed, "I think recognition takes time and I'm still building my career," which was diplomatic, but he looked at me with this knowing expression that suggested my careful non-answer had told him exactly what he needed to know. He thanked me for my kindness earlier in the day, signed that it had reminded him why he'd founded this company in the first place, and then he explained that he'd built Horizon Solutions because he was tired of being underestimated and dismissed, tired of having people assume his capabilities were limited because of their own limited imagination, and he wanted to create a place where what mattered was competence and character rather than perception or politics, or whether you fit someone's narrow expectations. Then he asked one more question, his expression very focused and serious. The client retention strategy that was presented today, do you know anything about it? And I felt my stomach tighten with anxiety because I didn't know how to answer that without either lying or explicitly undermining Karen. So I signed carefully. I worked on some of those concepts with my team, which was technically true, even if it drastically understated my role. And Richard's slight smile suggested he suspected there was considerably more to the story than I was saying. He thanked me again, told me the conversation had been valuable, and left through the main doors. And I sat alone in the empty lobby feeling stunned and uncertain and completely unsure what had just happened or what it might mean. That evening, the office gradually emptied out as the workday officially ended, people gathering their belongings and filtering toward the elevators with the relieved energy that always came at 5:30 on a weekday. And I was shutting down my computer and organizing the scattered papers on the reception desk when I heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see Karen walking toward me with this expression of absolute triumph, her face glowing with satisfaction and excitement in a way I'd rarely seen, practically vibrating with the success of the afternoon's presentation. She stopped at my desk and leaned against the counter with casual confidence and said, "That went even better than I hoped, Maya. I'm almost certain there's going to be a promotion announcement within the next few weeks." Mark practically said as much after the meeting ended. And I offered what I hoped was a convincing smile of congratulation, while something tight and familiar settled in my chest, the old pattern of watching her celebrate achievements that were built on my uncredited work. Then her expression shifted slightly, became a bit more pointed, and she said, "I noticed you had quite a conversation with Mr. Chen in the lobby. That was him you were signing with before the meeting, right?" And I nodded and explained that I'd just been trying to be helpful, that I'd noticed he was deaf, and wanted to make sure he felt welcome. And Karen made this dismissive gesture with her hand and said, "Well, try not to bother important visitors next time. It's better if you just stick to your role and let the leadership team handle high-level interactions." And the words hit me with particular force after the genuine warmth of my conversation with Richard Chen, after the way he'd asked real questions and listened to my answers and treated me like someone whose thoughts and experiences mattered. Karen didn't ask what we'd discussed, didn't seem even slightly curious about whether anything significant had been said, just assumed that whatever had passed between us was inconsequential because in her worldview, I was inconsequential. Just the receptionist who answered phones and shouldn't insert herself into important business. She gathered her designer handbag and headed toward the exit, calling back, "Have a good evening, and great work getting everything ready for today," which would have felt like meaningful acknowledgement, except that she'd never once that entire day thanked me for the presentation materials I'd prepared, or the strategy I'd developed, or the hours I'd spent perfecting content she'd presented as her own creation. I finished closing up the reception area and took the bus home to the apartment I shared with my mother and Daniel, feeling exhausted and conflicted and uncertain about everything that had happened. And over dinner, I told them about my day, about meeting the CEO of the company and discovering only afterward who he was, about the strange return conversation we'd had while the office was emptying out. Daniel was immediately excited, signing rapidly about how rare it was to meet a deaf CEO, asking questions about Richard Chen's signing style and whether I'd felt comfortable communicating with him, and my mother kept saying how proud she was that I'd used my ASL skills, that the language she'd supported us learning all those years ago had created this meaningful connection, that it was a gift to be able to bridge worlds the way I had that afternoon. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the day's events, I came back to something simple and clarifying. I had helped someone, and it had felt good, and that was enough. I didn't need anything more from the interaction than the satisfaction of having made someone feel welcomed and seen. I decided that whatever else happened or didn't happen, that moment of genuine human connection was its own reward. Separate from Karen's dismissiveness, or the office politics, or my invisible position in the corporate hierarchy, and I fell asleep thinking that maybe that was the lesson, that doing the right thing mattered regardless of whether anyone with power noticed or cared. The next morning, I arrived at the office at my usual time to find an unusual energy in the building. People clustered in small groups near the coffee station and by the elevators, talking in low, urgent voices with this quality of nervous speculation. And before I could even set my bag down at the reception desk, Sophie rushed over with wide eyes and said, "Maya, there's an emergency all-staff meeting called for 9 a.m. Everyone has to attend, no exceptions." And my stomach dropped because emergency meetings never meant anything good. People were already speculating about reorganization or layoffs or some kind of corporate announcement that would disrupt our careful routines. I looked across the office toward Karen's desk and saw her sitting calmly with this expression of supreme confidence, clearly expecting good news. Obviously anticipating that this sudden meeting would bring the promotion announcement she'd been so certain about the previous evening, and I felt a complicated mixture of resignation and that old familiar ache of knowing I'd watch her receive recognition for work that wasn't entirely hers while I remained invisible in my corner of the lobby. At 9 o'clock, the entire office crowded into the large conference room, people filling the chairs around the central table and lining up along the walls and clustering near the doorway because attendance was mandatory, and no one wanted to miss whatever announcement was significant enough to require this unprecedented gathering. And I found myself standing near the back corner next to Sophie, who gave my hand a quick supportive squeeze, while the nervous energy in the room built like static electricity before a storm. Mark Thompson, our regional director, stood at the front of the room looking unusually serious, his typical jovial expression replaced with something more formal and controlled. And he waited for the last stragglers to enter before calling the meeting to order and announcing that Richard Chen would be joining via video conference for an important announcement. And I felt my stomach drop because I hadn't expected the CEO to be involved in whatever this was about, hadn't imagined that his visit yesterday would extend into today's operations. The large screen at the front of the room flickered to life, and Richard Chen appeared with a professional interpreter standing beside him, and he began speaking in sign language while the interpreter voiced his words for the hearing staff, explaining that he wanted to talk about Horizon Solutions' foundational values and what the company stood for, beyond quarterly earnings and client contracts and market position. His message, delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that commanded attention, focused on how the company had been founded on principles of respect and recognition of genuine talent and authentic leadership. How he'd built Horizon Solutions because he was tired of corporate cultures that valued appearance over substance and politics over performance. And I watched his hands move with precise emphasis while my heart started beating faster with a feeling I couldn't quite name, something between anxiety and anticipation. He explained that during his visits to regional offices, he paid close attention to how people treated each other, especially how staff members interacted with those they perceived as less important or lower in the corporate hierarchy, because those unguarded moments revealed the true culture of a workplace more accurately than any mission statement or values poster on the break room wall. I felt Sophie shift beside me, and I knew she was thinking about the implications of this, about what Richard might have observed during his time in our office yesterday, and I saw Karen across the room still wearing that expression of confident expectation, clearly believing this preamble was building toward recognition of her successful presentation. Richard continued, his expression growing more serious, explaining that he was disturbed by patterns he'd observed in some regional offices, a culture where credit was systematically misplaced and genuine talent was overlooked, and people who did the actual work remained invisible, while others claimed their achievements, and the room had gone completely silent now, everyone listening with focused attention to where this was heading. He specifically mentioned the client retention strategy that had been presented to him yesterday, called it impressive and innovative work, said he'd wanted to understand its true origins and development, and after the meeting ended, he'd done something he rarely did, which was personally review the internal email records and document trails and project files to trace the strategy back to its source. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable, people glancing at each other uncertainly, and I saw Karen shift in her seat, with the first hint of discomfort crossing her face, though she still maintained that confident posture, and then Richard Chen looked directly at the camera and said with absolute clarity, "I discovered the true architect of that strategy." Richard Chen looked directly at the camera with an expression of absolute clarity and said my full name. "Maya Rodriguez, could you stand up, please?" And for a moment I couldn't move because I thought I'd misheard. Thought perhaps there was another Maya Rodriguez somewhere in the company, but then shock rippled through the conference room like a wave, and all eyes turned toward me in the back corner, and I realized with a sensation like falling that he meant me. He was talking about me. And Sophie gave me a little push of encouragement, and somehow my legs cooperated enough to stand. Though my heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat, and my face flushed hot with the sudden attention of 50 colleagues who yesterday barely knew my name. Richard Chen continued speaking, his hands moving in sign language while the interpreter voiced his words, and he thanked me for my innovative work on the client retention strategy. But he didn't just offer a general compliment. He went into specific elements that had impressed him, talking about the tiered communication protocol I'd designed, and the feedback integration system, and the predictive modeling for client needs, demonstrating that he hadn't just glanced at the strategy, but had truly studied it and understood its value, and appreciated the depth of thought that had gone into its creation. He explained that after the meeting yesterday, he'd spent several hours reviewing internal email records and project files, tracing the original proposal back 18 months through the company's document management system. And he discovered that the strategy Karen presented as a team effort was actually entirely my work, conceived and developed and refined by me alone over the course of nearly 2 years. I saw Karen's face across the room drain of all color, watched her confident expression crumble into something trapped and desperate, and part of me felt a twist of sympathy, even as another part felt the sharp satisfaction of truth finally being acknowledged after so many months of invisibility. But Richard wasn't finished, and what he said next made my eyes sting with unexpected emotion, because he said, what impressed me even more than Maya's professional work was her character. And he described our interaction in the lobby yesterday, how I'd approached him with natural kindness and helped him without any pretense or calculation, how I'd treated him like a person who mattered rather than an important executive to impress, because I hadn't known he was an important executive. I'd simply seen someone who needed assistance and provided it with grace and warmth. She had no idea who I was, he said, and it didn't matter. She saw someone who needed help, and she offered it genuinely, and that exemplifies the values that Horizon Solutions should embody at every level. And then he announced that effective immediately, I was being promoted to Senior Client Strategy Director, a position created specifically for me that would report directly to regional leadership, with a salary of $95,000 annually, plus equity in the company, and full benefits. The conference room erupted in surprised murmurs and scattered applause, Sophie clapping enthusiastically beside me with tears in her eyes. And I stood there completely frozen, unable to process what was happening, unable to reconcile this moment with every assumption I'd held about my place in this company and my value in this world. Richard wasn't finished speaking, and the atmosphere in the conference room shifted from surprise celebration to something more serious and uncomfortable as he addressed the issue of credit and leadership directly, his expression grave as he stated through his interpreter that taking credit for others' work wasn't just poor management, but a terminable offense in Horizon Solutions culture, a violation of the fundamental values upon which the company had been built. He didn't name Karen directly, but his gaze moved in her direction, and everyone in the room understood exactly who he was talking about. And he said clearly, supervisors who build themselves up by standing on their employees' accomplishments, who advance their own careers by claiming work they didn't do, have no place in this organization. And the words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Richard then asked Mark Thompson to comment on the situation, and our regional director stood looking deeply uncomfortable. His face flushed as he admitted that he should have paid closer attention to team dynamics and project attributions, that he had relied too heavily on supervisor reports without verifying the actual sources of innovative work. And he took responsibility for failing to create an environment where people like me felt safe bringing forward concerns about credit misappropriation. Mark announced that effective immediately, a full review of all project attributions over the past 3 years would be conducted, that HR would be examining email records and document trails to ensure proper credit was given where it was due. And then he said the words that made the room go completely silent. Karen Morrison was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending the investigation, and if the findings confirmed systematic credit misappropriation, her employment would be terminated. Karen stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, her face red with a mixture of humiliation and fury, and she looked directly at me with an expression of pure rage and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "You went behind my back. You complained to the CEO. You couldn't handle the chain of command, so you went over everyone's head." And 50 pairs of eyes turned to watch my response to this accusation. I found my voice somehow, steadier than I expected, and I said calmly, "I never said anything against you, Karen. I answered Mr. Chen's questions honestly when he asked me about my work. That's all I did." And Richard confirmed this immediately, stating for the record that I had shown nothing but professionalism during our conversation, that I had actually been quite modest about my contributions, and that his investigation had been entirely independent, based on document review, rather than any complaint from me. Karen grabbed her bag from under the conference table, and 2 HR representatives, who had been standing quietly by the door, moved forward to escort her out, and she left without another word. Though her expression of betrayal and anger burned itself into my memory, and I felt a complicated mix of vindication and genuine sadness because despite everything she'd done to me, I took no pleasure in watching another person's career collapse in front of their colleagues. The meeting concluded with Richard congratulating me once more and adding one final note that made my heart race again. He would be returning to Seattle next month and wanted to meet with me personally to discuss my vision for the client strategy department and how we might expand those initiatives across other regional offices. The screen went dark. Mark dismissed everyone, and suddenly I was surrounded by colleagues, some offering genuine congratulations, some clearly shocked by the dramatic reversal they'd just witnessed, some perhaps wondering what this meant for their own relationships with Karen and whether they might face scrutiny in the investigation. Sophie pushed through the small crowd and hugged me tightly, whispering in my ear, "You deserved this. Every bit of it. Don't you dare feel guilty." And I held on to her for a moment because she was the only person in that room who had consistently seen my worth, even when I'd been invisible to everyone else. After the meeting, Mark Thompson asked me to come to his office, and I walked down the corridor in a kind of daze, still processing everything that had happened in the last hour. And when I sat down across from his desk, he looked at me with an expression of genuine regret and said he owed me an apology, that he had failed as a leader by not seeing what was happening right under his nose. He explained that he had relied too heavily on Karen's reports and her assessments of team performance without taking the time to verify the actual sources of the innovative work coming out of her department, and he took full responsibility for creating an environment where someone like me hadn't felt safe bringing forward concerns about credit misappropriation or unfair treatment. He promised that moving forward, he would be more present and more attentive, that he would implement regular one-on-one meetings with all staff members, not just supervisors. And then he shifted into the practical details of my new role, and suddenly the reality of what senior client strategy director actually meant began to sink in. I would be building my own team from scratch, he explained. I would have budget authority to hire up to 6 people initially. I would lead strategy development for the entire Pacific Northwest region, and I would report directly to him and to the Vice President of Client Relations at corporate headquarters. I asked him what would happen to the people who had been on Karen's team, the colleagues who would now technically be reporting to me, and he assured me that HR would handle the transition carefully, that there would be individual conversations to ensure everyone was comfortable with the new structure, and that anyone who felt awkward about the change would be given options to transfer to other departments. When I returned to my desk, which I realized with a strange jolt was no longer actually my desk, because I would be moving to a real office with a door and a window, Sophie was already there waiting to help me pack up the few personal items I kept in my drawer, a photo of Daniel and my mother, a coffee mug with a funny saying, some pens I particularly liked. The morning felt completely surreal, and I kept expecting to wake up and find myself back in my old reality, where I was invisible and undervalued. And I pulled out my phone and texted Daniel. Something incredible happened at work. I'll tell you everything tonight. And within an hour, my mother called during her lunch break. And when I explained what had happened, she started crying happy tears and told me she always knew I was special, that she always knew my hard work would be recognized eventually. The afternoon disappeared into a blur of HR paperwork and meetings with various department heads who wanted to introduce themselves now that I was suddenly important enough to know. And people who had barely acknowledged my existence yesterday were now stopping by to offer congratulations and to say they'd always thought I had great ideas. And the shift was disorienting, but also deeply validating in a way I hadn't expected. Sophie took me out for coffee after work, and our dynamic had shifted subtly, but our friendship remained intact, and I admitted to her that despite everything Karen had done to me, I felt guilty about what had happened to her, about watching her career collapse so publicly and so completely. Sophie looked at me with fierce certainty and said, Karen made her own choices for years. She chose to steal credit and build her career on other people's work. You didn't do anything except exist authentically and answer questions honestly. And I reflected on the strange randomness of it all. How if Richard Chen hadn't been deaf, or if I hadn't approached him, or if I'd been less kind in that moment, then none of this would have happened. But Sophie shook her head and said, It wasn't random, Maya. Your character was always there. Your competence was always there. It just finally got witnessed by someone who had the power to do something about it. 2 weeks after the promotion, I was settling into my new role and still adjusting to the reality that I had an office with a window overlooking downtown Seattle, that I had a team of 4 people who reported directly to me, that I had budget approval authority up to $15,000 without needing additional sign-off, and the physical trappings of my new position were disorienting in their contrast to the cramped desk I'd occupied for 3 years in the open floor plan where everyone could see me being invisible. The transition hadn't been entirely smooth because some of my former peers clearly resented my sudden elevation, and I could feel their sideways looks during department meetings, their whispered conversations that stopped when I approached, their careful politeness that masked what I suspected was a belief that I'd somehow manipulated my way into this position rather than earned it through years of uncredited work. But most people seemed to recognize that I had been qualified all along, just systematically overlooked. And several colleagues had privately told me they were glad to see merit finally recognized, even if the circumstances of that recognition had been dramatic and uncomfortable for everyone to witness. I made a deliberate point of crediting my team publicly in every meeting and every email, having learned from Karen's negative example exactly what kind of leader I didn't want to be. And I implemented transparent communication practices, including shared project documents, where everyone's contributions were documented in real time, so there could never be any question about who had originated which ideas. The investigation into Karen had concluded after 10 days, and the results were worse than anyone had expected. HR's review of email records and project files going back 5 years revealed a systematic pattern of her appropriating subordinates' work. At least 7 different employees, whose proposals and strategies she had presented as her own. And her employment was terminated with cause, which meant no severance package and no positive reference for future positions. I felt complicated emotions about this outcome, a sense of satisfaction that justice had been served and that her victims had been validated, but absolutely no joy in witnessing another person's career collapse so completely and so publicly, because despite what she'd done to me, I couldn't forget that she was still a human being who would now struggle to find comparable work in our industry. I reached out to 3 other former members of Karen's team, people who had left Horizon Solutions over the past 2 years, and I learned that they too had experienced having their ideas stolen and their contributions minimized, and I began the slow work of rebuilding trust and creating a healthier culture where people felt safe sharing innovative thoughts without fear of having them appropriated by someone higher in the hierarchy. Richard Chen's executive assistant emailed me in the 3rd week with a subject line that made my heart race. She was scheduling the promised follow-up meeting for exactly 1 month from the date of my promotion, and she asked me to prepare a 30-minute presentation on my vision for expanding client strategy initiatives across the Pacific Northwest region and potentially to other Horizon Solutions offices. I worked on that presentation during my evenings, sitting at my small kitchen table with my laptop and notes spread around me, feeling excited and nervous in equal measure, because this was an opportunity to share ideas I'd been developing for years, but had never had a platform to present. Daniel visited for a weekend during this time, taking the train up from Oregon, where he was finishing his last semester before transferring to Gallaudet University in the fall. And I showed him my office with its window and its door that closed and its desk that was 3 times the size of my old workspace, and he looked around with obvious pride and signed to me, "You showed them who you really are." But I realized as I watched him that I hadn't actually shown them anything different than I'd always been, that my character and my competence had been constant, and the only thing that had changed was that someone with power had finally been paying attention. 1 month after the promotion, Richard Chen returned to the Seattle office, and this time everyone knew exactly who he was. The entire building hummed with nervous preparation. People wore their best professional clothes and spoke in hushed, respectful tones, and I walked into the executive conference room at exactly 2 o'clock, feeling my heart pound with an excitement I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Richard greeted me warmly in ASL when I entered, his face breaking into a genuine smile that immediately put me at ease, and he asked how I was adjusting to the new role, and whether the transition had been manageable, and I answered honestly that it had been challenging, but rewarding, that I was learning to trust my own judgment and to lead with the same values he had demonstrated. I presented my vision for expanding client strategy initiatives across the Pacific Northwest region and potentially to other Horizon Solutions offices, explaining that I wanted to move beyond simple retention metrics toward genuine relationship building that recognized the full humanity of every client we served. And I proposed implementing comprehensive training for all client-facing staff in basic accessibility practices, including fundamental ASL signs, not because we had a large deaf client base, but because creating a culture of attentiveness to diverse communication needs would transform how we approached every interaction. Richard watched me present with complete focus, occasionally signing questions that demonstrated he wasn't just being polite, but was genuinely engaged with the substance of what I was proposing. And when I finished, he asked me to break down the implementation timeline and budget requirements in greater detail, questions I had anticipated and prepared for during those evening hours at my kitchen table. He approved my proposal without hesitation and offered an additional $50,000 in implementation budget beyond what I had requested, telling me he wanted this program to succeed and to become a model for other regional offices. And then he did something unexpected. He began to share his own story with me, signing about how he had built Horizon Solutions after being repeatedly passed over for promotions at 3 previous companies where executives and investors had dismissed him because they assumed his deafness indicated limited capability or vision. He told me about the frustration of watching less qualified colleagues advance while he remained stuck, despite his track record of results. About the determination that had fueled him to start his own company, where substance would matter more than perception and merit would matter more than office politics. And he said that when he met me in the lobby that afternoon a month ago, he had seen something of his younger self. Someone who was competent and quietly excellent, but systematically overlooked by people who should have known better. He admitted that the promotion hadn't been based solely on my professional skills, though those were clearly evident in the work I had produced, but rather, it had been about my character, about the fact that I had helped someone without any calculation or expectation of reward, that I had seen a person who needed assistance and provided it with natural grace and genuine warmth. That's the culture I want in my company, he signed to me. People who lead with humanity first and business acumen second, because the business results always follow when you get the humanity right. Then he asked me a question that made my breath catch. Would I be interested in eventually moving to corporate headquarters in San Francisco, not immediately, but as my career continued to develop, because there would be opportunities for someone with my combination of strategic thinking and authentic leadership? I was honest with him in my response, signing that I was deeply committed to staying in Seattle for now because my family was here, and my brother Daniel would need support as he transitioned to Gallaudet University in the fall, but that I was genuinely open to exploring future possibilities as circumstances evolved. Richard nodded with obvious respect and signed that loyalty to family was another quality he valued highly, that he would never ask someone to choose between career advancement and the people they loved, and that the opportunity would remain available whenever I felt ready to consider it. 6 months after the promotion, I was fully established in my role as Senior Client Strategy Director, and the transformation felt both surreal and completely natural at the same time, like slipping into a life that had been waiting for me all along, but that I'd been locked out of until someone with the right key had opened the door. My team had grown from the initial 4 people to 7, a mix of internal transfers who had expressed interest in the accessibility initiative, and 2 external hires who brought fresh perspectives from companies that had prioritized inclusive client relations, and together we had increased client satisfaction scores by 34% across the Pacific Northwest region, a number that had caught the attention of executives at the national level. The accessibility training program I had proposed during that meeting with Richard Chen was being rolled out company-wide now, starting with all regional offices and eventually expanding to every Horizon Solutions location globally, and I had been asked to present the program's development and results at the national conference next quarter in front of more than 500 employees and executives. Sophie had been promoted to IT director 3 months ago, and we had celebrated together at our favorite coffee shop, laughing about how far we'd both come from those days, when she would find me working late at my cramped desk while Karen took credit for everything I produced. And our friendship had remained constant, even as our professional positions had shifted, because real friendship isn't threatened by mutual success. I had moved to a better apartment in Capitol Hill with actual space and natural light, and a second bedroom that I used as a home office, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck, wasn't calculating every grocery purchase, wasn't lying awake at night worrying about unexpected expenses, and I was able to contribute $500 a month toward Daniel's tuition at Gallaudet University, which had started in August, and where he was thriving in ways that made my heart swell with pride every time we video called. My mother was proud of my success, but she kept reminding me to stay humble, to remember where I came from, to treat people with kindness regardless of their position, and I assured her that those values were exactly what had led to this opportunity in the first place, and that I had no intention of forgetting them. One afternoon in late November, I was at my desk reviewing quarterly reports when a new junior employee named Jessica approached my office door, knocking tentatively, even though the door was open. And she asked if I had a few minutes to discuss a project she was working on because she wasn't sure if her approach was correct, and she seemed nervous and intimidated in a way that immediately reminded me of who I had been just 6 months earlier. I invited her in, asked her to sit down, and I took genuine time to listen to her ideas about improving the onboarding process for new clients. And I realized as she spoke that her proposal had real merit, that she had identified a gap in our current system that I hadn't noticed. And I told her so directly and specifically, making sure she understood that this was her idea and that I would credit her when I brought it to the leadership team. After she left looking relieved and energized, I sat for a moment reflecting on the entire experience of the past 6 months, on everything that had changed and everything that had remained constant. And I realized that the most important transformation hadn't been the title or the salary or the office with the window overlooking the city, though all of those things were wonderful and validating. The real change had been internal, a fundamental shift in how I understood my own worth, a recognition that my value had always existed independent of whether anyone else acknowledged it. And while the promotion had validated what was true, it couldn't be the foundation of my sense of self because external validation is too unstable to build a life on. I thought about that moment 6 months ago when I had greeted Richard Chen in the lobby, when I had approached him with natural kindness and offered assistance without knowing who he was or what power he held. And I asked myself honestly if I would have behaved differently if I had known his identity. And I concluded that probably I wouldn't have, because that authenticity wasn't a performance or a strategy, but simply who I was when I allowed myself to act on my natural impulses toward helpfulness and connection. Sophie had been right when she told me it wasn't random, that my character had always been there, and it had just finally been witnessed by someone who had the power and the willingness to respond to it. And I kept a small note on my desk now with something Daniel had signed to me during one of our video calls. Your value doesn't change based on who's watching. I had learned to watch myself, to recognize my own contributions, to validate my own worth before seeking that validation from others. And while the external recognition was satisfying and professionally valuable, it was no longer necessary for my fundamental sense of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. I was committed to creating for my team exactly what Karen had never created for her team: a workplace culture where talent was genuinely seen and acknowledged, where contributions were properly credited, where people were valued as whole human beings rather than as instruments for someone else's advancement. And I checked in regularly with each team member to make sure they felt heard and supported and recognized. That evening, I video called Daniel at Gallaudet, and we signed to each other about our weeks, his filled with classes and new friendships and the joy of being in a community where his deafness wasn't a barrier, but simply one aspect of his identity. Mine filled with strategy meetings and team development and the ongoing work of building something meaningful. And as we talked, I realized that we were both thriving in ways that would have seemed impossible a year ago. I thought about that simple act of greeting someone in sign language in a corporate lobby, about how a moment of authentic kindness had catalyzed a series of events that had transformed my professional life. But I understood now that the act itself hadn't changed anything fundamental about who I was or what I was worth. My life had changed when I decided, somewhere in the process of all of this, that my worth wasn't dependent on Karen's acknowledgement or anyone else's approval, that I had value regardless of whether anyone in a position of power recognized it, and the promotion had simply been the universe catching up to a truth I was learning to accept about myself. I was always valuable, always competent, always worthy of respect and recognition, and someone with power had finally noticed, and that was satisfying in ways I couldn't fully articulate, but it was no longer necessary for my sense of self because I had learned to see myself clearly. I closed my laptop and began preparing for tomorrow, laying out my clothes for an early morning presentation, reviewing my notes one final time, feeling confident and grounded and truly seen, most importantly by myself.